How can we talk about morality? How can we compare moral systems? We have to compare them morally. If we have paganism and Christianity and we say that these are real systems, that they have describable qualities, how do we compare them? How do we say that the one is different from the other? We're always going to be coming at this from a pre-existing moral position. No one can be a human without having pre-existing moral beliefs. Even if you're a nihilist, that's a statement about morality. Most people who speak language could not tell you how or why or what they use to speak. If you ask somebody, what is syntax? They're either going to tell you it's a medical prescription or it's something you pay when you do something wrong, the syntax. The syntax is a legitimate term. It has meaning. It's useful to use in the discussion of language. But most people, when they use language, they don't know what syntax is, and they don't even have an equivalent word for syntax. Maybe people know rules of language. People don't know what syntax is. People don't know what a gerund or a noun. Well, maybe they do teach you what nouns and verbs and adjectives are, and adverbs, but the idiomatic aspects of language probably have labels. When we say the big brown bear as opposed to the brown big bear, there's probably some highfalutin Latin term that explains exactly what that's called, that particularity of word order. Why is the adjective relating to size coming before the adjective relating to color? Someone has probably given that a label. I don't know what the label is. We could look it up. We could do a Google search. But the point here is that we all use language, but we can't describe our language. Unless you're a linguist, most people can't describe language. They don't know how or why or what they use to form sentences. They don't know what organizes or rules their formation of language, and yet everyone uses it. In the same way, I don't think most people understand the how or why or even the what of morality. When people see something they think is wrong or disgusting on a moral level, they know it when they see it, but can they tell you why it's wrong? What exactly about it is wrong? How is it wrong? Most people just point and say, it's just wrong. Nothing more needs to be said. But if we're going to try to embark on this quest to compare different moral perspectives, then it would probably be useful to understand the how, what, where, why, the facts of the matter as objectively as possible, even though I've already stated we're always going to be coming at this subjectively. We're always going to start from a predetermined moral position. We can't escape that. There are essentially two ways of approaching morality. The one way is a kind of intuitivism, that we simply trust our feelings. Whatever we feel, that's the right way to feel. If you feel lust, follow your lust. If you feel anger, follow that anger. If you feel that something is beautiful, it's beautiful. If you feel it's ugly, it's ugly. Whatever your intuition tells you. And that is useful in many great cases. And the reason why is because our intuition, I believe, was developed through the constraints of our environment that provided a selective pressure. And so people, or specifically men in this case, men who found women with symmetrical faces to be attractive, who felt lust toward these women, who then wanted to invest in trying to mate with these women and have children with these women, raise those children. All of those kinds of behaviors were selected because the environment has this constraint that of fitness, right? If you don't have a symmetrical face, why not? Is it because you have a genetic defect? Is it because you had a disease growing up? Why is your face not symmetrical? Well, there could be a huge number of reasons. And there might be people with symmetrical faces who are, you could say, unfairly discriminated against. Perfectly fine, intelligent, good people who just happen to have faces that aren't symmetrical. And that's fine. But in terms of evolution, we developed intuitions in response to the constraints of our environment. That is, we don't have unlimited time and energy and resources to dedicate to the process of living and reproducing, and so we have to be selective. We have to choose one thing over the other. And so I think that's where moral behavior starts. I think it starts when the animal says, I'm attracted to the light. That is a kind of morality, a kind of intuition. The moth is attracted to the flame. Now, obviously, it's a bit silly for the moth to be attracted to the flame if the flame is actually a bug zapper, and the moth is attracted to the bug zapper and gets zapped. That's pretty silly. At that point, you say, okay, the intuition has broken down because the environment has changed. The humans have invented this bug zapper, and now everything's out of whack. The interesting thing about human beings is we have this ability to change our environment radically. And so we have all these moral intuitions. You could say these are the basic animalistic moral intuitions. If a person is asymmetrical, they're less beautiful. Feces smell bad, and we want to avoid them. Just all these commonsensical things that across cultures are basically biological intuitions that we have. We like people who are strong. We use this term healthy, which has been undermined by the left so much of what even is health? Healthy at any size. You can be sick and still healthy at the same time. All of these kind of paradoxes that we get into. The left is ascribing to a morality that is antithetical to intuition. There are some intuitive aspects of the left, the desire for fairness, the desire for equality, the desire for egalitarianism, that people shouldn't just arbitrarily have power, that we should have a merit-based system, that we shouldn't be cruel, we shouldn't be sadistic, we shouldn't be all these things. Those are also based on intuition, so I wouldn't say the left is free from intuition. But the left, in many cases, rejects a lot of the intuitive forms of morality. And clearly, if you reject intuition, you have to have a different authority. If your authority is not intuitive, it's got to be something else, right? You still have to have a moral authority. If you have a moral system, it's got to come from somewhere. So the question is, where does it come from? If it's not intuitive, if it's not biological, what fills the gap? What fills the void? It has to be essentially what we call doctrine or dogma or ideology, which is a mimetic system. It's not a genetic system. It's not, and I do believe there are essentially genes in our DNA that tell us feces smell bad. Symmetrical faces are attractive. Strength, muscles, those are attractive, Being anorexic, not attractive. Being super obese, probably also not attractive to the majority of people. I think there is a genetic basis for a lot of these things. Now, I haven't discovered the gene. I haven't mapped out the gene. I'm not a biologist, not a scientist. But I think there's good reason to believe that such genes do exist, alleles, groups of genes that do contribute to these kind of moralistic intuitions that we have. We could say as a kind of more animal morality. But as I gave with the moth example and the bug zapper, there's clearly cases where our moral intuitions formed in an environment that is radically different from the one we presently inhabit. So when somebody says, let's say two moths are having a discussion, and the one moth says, I am a Bronze Age moth, I am a pagan moth, and I follow my intuition wherever it takes me. When I feel lust, I follow my lust. I feel anger, I follow my anger. I see beauty, I pursue beauty. When I see ugliness, I reject it. I am a pagan moth, and I am proud. And I follow the tradition of my moth ancestors, and I will be a strong, powerful moth. And the Christian moth says, and maybe it's not a Christian moth, because again, most Christians, I don't think could articulate all this. I think most Christians are not very philosophically oriented or educated or anything like that. But there is, let's say, an anti-pagan moth. This moth says, well, that sounds all well and good, and surely our intuitions are not, they didn't come from nowhere. They obviously came from somewhere. They're not arbitrary. The fact that we moths were attracted to the light, it's not arbitrary. It's not accidental. It's purposeful. We moths, we evolved to love the light. And we don't have to look back at our evolution and the formation of this intuition as some kind of cosmic accident or randomness. We can actually understand it. We can actually look back and say, hey, here's the why we moths are attracted to the light. But our environment has changed. And now these humans have invented these bug zappers. And as the anti-pagan moth, I think that while there are still some cases where intuitions can be trusted, I think we always have to check our intuitions. You know, I still believe in the intuition that we should seek after water to drink. I still think we should we should still learn how to fly. And yeah, our love of flight as moths, like that's a legitimate love that we have. I'm not saying that we should go so far as the leftist moths who say that flying is evil because not all moths can fly and we should stay. Do they come from caterpillars or larvae? What's because I know butterflies come from caterpillars. Do we say moths come from caterpillars or slugs, or I don't know what the biological term is. Anyway, we come from these wormy, there are leftist moths who say we should just be worms forever, and that anyone who grows wings, we should clip their wings off so we can all be equal. Obviously, these people have disregarded our intuitions, and they've picked up a mimetics and dogma that's been invented by the humans to kill us. The humans, in their anti-moth genocide, their evil plot, their evil plan, right? They've taught us moths that we should hate our wings, we should never fly, and we should just be little worms on the ground. Obviously, that's anti-moth slant. Like that's poison, right? That's a form of ideological poison. So just because as an anti-pagan moth, just because I'm saying we should not always embrace our intuitions doesn't mean that I think we should do whatever the opposite of our intuition says. And it doesn't mean that I'm saying we should adopt any dogma or any mimetic system or any authority that tells us to do, that's ridiculous. What we have to do is we have to say our intuitions formed as a result of a historical process. We can understand that process. But our intuitions are leading us astray. We keep flying into this bug zapper, and we have to stop. We have to use our moth brains, our moth minds, and we have to stop flying into the bug zapper. Doesn't mean we have to stop eating or growing wings or flying about. All that stuff is still good. Those intuitions, they're still good. But we have to be able to check our intuitions and question our intuitions and say, is this really what we should be doing? And that's a difficult process. But I think we can clearly say that flying into this bug zapper, not a good idea, right? Not a good idea. Even though our intuitions tell us we should, we have to resist the compulsion. And that produces what we call moth guilt or moth shame, right? When you as a moth, you really want to fly in that bug zapper, but then your moth mind tells you, oh, that's not such a good idea. Think about the future consequences. Think about how burnt and crispy you will be. That produces a lot of guilt and shame, you want to fly that bug zapper, but you just can't, and it doesn't feel good, right? There's a lot of negativity that comes out of that, and then, I guess in this case, moth Christianity comes along and says, hey, I know you're feeling a lot of guilt right now, and psychologically you don't know what to do with it. Here is a way of working through that problem, right? Where you really want to fly to that bug zapper, but you know you shouldn't, and it's causing you a lot of internal cognitive dissonance. I'm going to give you a system to try to alleviate that suffering and try to work through that, where you don't have to fly into that, because there are a lot of people who say just fly into the bug zapper, right? Don't care about the consequences, just do what you YOLO, moth YOLO, just fly into the bug zapper. and it will be fine. And that's, all that life is just about following your instincts and your passions, just flying the bug zapper. There's a problem with that, right? But on the other hand, if you're stuck in this dissonance where you shouldn't fly the bug zapper, but you're craving it and you're fiending after it, and then you're feeling this guilt and shame and it's just all this negativity, and you can't handle it because you can't change your genetic intuitions, right? You can't change the fact that your body is telling you, go toward the light. You can't change that. And so it's just a terrible position to be in. It feels like hell, to be honest. So then somebody comes along with Mothianity or whatever and says, here's a system, here's a set of beliefs, here's a way of thinking about things that's going to try to help you. And it might be complex, and there might be dogmas, and there might be rules or rituals. There might be names and appellations. There might be, you're going to work through things linguistically. There's all kind of features to it. It's not easy to sum up or describe, but we're going to give you a system. And the pagan moths say, oh, that's evil. Evil system made us weak. We should be strong moths, because, of course, the problem is when moths start thinking abstractly about their moth intuitions, they drift from their intuitions. And if a meme is strong enough, if a meme is powerful enough, the meme can reproduce in the same way a virus can reproduce. A virus reproduced by infecting the host and then spreading from the host to other hosts in the surrounding area. And that's what memes do, right? That's what pornography does, right? You see pornography, you distribute the pornography. This is how pornography is distributed. It's distributed mimetically. Anything like this, drugs, right? Drugs are distributed from person to person. There are all kinds of behaviors that we engage with that are not healthy, and some of them are ideological. I feel bad. I feel guilty because I was bullied, because I'm obese, because I'm a minority, because whatever. And this causes me guilt and shame. And as a solution to this, I say, well, you know what? Doesn't matter whether you're obese. Doesn't matter any of these things, whatever I was bullied over. I shouldn't feel shame. If I'm a sex addict and I spend every day, I'm spending all of my sexual energy on casual encounters, and I'm getting STDs, and I'm unable to have a stable relationship. Well, you could just take the leftist position, which is as long as you're not physically hurting anybody and as long as it's not against our ideology, do whatever you want. And anyone who shames you is evil. So we can see how there are a lot of ideologies that spread not because they are some kind of rationalistic, intelligent critique of intuitions and saying, as we have these intuitions and sometimes they're good, but our environment has changed. We need to recognize that sometimes these dogmas and ideologies spread simply because they feel good, not because they're serving us. It feels good to just say, hey man, I am who I am. Don't judge me. I'm perfect just the way I am. It feels good. You can get high off that. Literally. I mean, the brain chemistry, the brain's amazing, okay? You can feel some amazing things without any need for drugs. It can feel amazing to be a white person and being told by a black person to kneel on the ground for white privilege and say you're sorry. There's actually a kind of sadomasochistic, fetishistic sexual energy in that people feel good. And yet you've got right-wing people calling for military in the streets. Let's get the military in the streets. There's a kind of sexual, domination, submission aspect to that. It's obviously not physical in the sense that it's not two human beings having bodily intimacy with each other. But, I mean, these aspects do exist. And so there are a lot of ideologies, ideological systems, aspects of ideological systems that fall into the same problem that our intuitions fall into. That is, they can kind of run away from us. We have intuitions that were developed in the past that When I say invented, I'm talking about a process of selection because of environmental constraints, evolution, just using that anthropomorphization of invention, right? We have these intuitions that came about basically with the purpose to help us, and now environment has changed and now they're hurting us. With mimetic ideological systems, you can have a system that comes along through abstraction that just makes me feel good because I can say, I'm healthy at any size, no matter what I do, it's fine as long as it doesn't hurt any other people. When we can inspect that and we can say, yeah, this is a very abstracted system, but it's also very harmful. It's harmful to the person who believes in it, and it's harmful to the people around them. And so we can't just say because the system is abstract that it's correct. We also can't say that because the system is intuitive that it's correct. We actually have to do the hard work of trying to understand what is our environment. We have to use all our perceptual tools, not just our intuitive perception, but we also have to understand the facts, the figures, and statistics to the best of our ability. And no one person can do all of that. So we have to rely on authorities, and we have to be able to find authorities that we can trust that are delivering us information with the intent to help us and not to hurt us. Because, to be honest, it seems like a lot of the authorities out there are spreading ideological poison that is hypocritical. You know, they'll say, was the founder of that... what's the Ashley Madison, right? He advocates that people cheat on their partners, but do all of his employees or whatever do that? I think he might have been caught in some kind of cheating scandal. I don't remember exactly. I think the example is less good now because I think he did get caught practicing adultery at one point or another. But regardless of whether the people practice it themselves, it's still, we can see the perverse incentives in a democratic system where the people at the top look at the majority of society and they say, we don't care about you. In fact, you're a threat to our monopolization of power, so we're going to intentionally spread ideological poison as much as we can. So there is no easy heuristic where we can just assume the intuitions are correct, and we also just can't assume that if a system is abstracted that it's correct. We actually have to go through the almost impossible task of trying to discern which authorities are to be trusted, which are not. And in this world, honestly, the incentives are not set up to have a bunch of really good authorities who are actually invested and who get some kind of return on their investment for spreading good morality, right? We just don't have that. And that's a pretty tough situation to be in, but that's the situation we find ourselves in. Morally speaking, prior to urbanism, prior to this massive environmental change that humans undertook on themselves, this form of self-domestication, morality was easier. Morality was just basically a matter of good genetics and intuitions. It's like, oh, she's beautiful? Okay, I'm attracted to her. Okay, I'm going to follow my attraction. You know, oh, that guy's like weird and ugly? Like, okay, down with him. In fact, maybe we should exclude him, perhaps. You know, that's the way that animals act, right? The runt of the litter doesn't get the milk, doesn't get the mother's milk. The big, strong piglet, he is who gets the milk. That's the way nature works. But as human beings, we have the ability to change our environment so much so that evolution can't play catch-up fast enough, that our intuitive faculties have not changed quickly enough to adapt to the new environments that we've created. And so we have to use our abstraction to step in and say, no, your intuitions aren't always correct. Sometimes you have to have a layer of abstraction to mediate between what your intuition says and what is actually best for you. But people look at this process by which abstraction and abstracted systems of morality are used as a poison to hurt people, and they say, okay, all abstraction is bad. We should just, I guess, lift weights and tan naked. I don't know. Which is its own idea. I mean, a lot of it might be derived from intuitions, but there is still a layer of abstraction that's kind of like, it's kind of like in the same way that sex is natural and pornography simulates sex. So in a sense, when we seek after porn, we're seeking after something that might be fundamentally natural, but the way it's presented to us is through artifice. In the same way that, being muscular and tan or whatever, spending time outside, there's the desire for that is natural, it is intuitive, but the way that people are presenting it is through this artificial lens. That you're not quite getting back to the golden age of muscular, tanned warriors. You're not quite actually achieving that. You are forming a simulacrum, and you are emulating that simulacrum, but that's not the same thing as actually living as a hunter-gatherer 10,000 years ago. If you're on Twitter posting about that, you are actually not the thing that you are presenting as. That's a problem that cannot be resolved. You can never escape the technological system that we have, even if you go full Ted and you live in the woods. Even then, right, you can't erase your memories. You can't erase your past. That is still a part of you. Even if your body leaves civilization, you're going to take it with you mentally. So my argument is we can't just go back. We can't just go back to paganism. There's also clearly Christianity established a new regime of moral consciousness that has opened up the possibility for all of these moral poisons, all of these ideological systems that are really self-serving or that are basically devised by people. And this is what Nietzsche said. Nietzsche said that Christianity itself was a moral poison that was basically invented out of a desire for revenge. That's Nietzsche's take. And clearly, a lot of the ideological systems that followed Christianity they wouldn't have been possible without Christianity. Christianity established the precedent for a type of abstracted moral thinking that was not possible, in the ancient past. I would argue that you look at Greek philosophy, and Greek philosophy really, and Stoicism and all of that, really does engage in a lot of abstracted morality that actually was a prerequisite for Christianity. And we could look at the origins of Judaism. We could look at Zoroastrianism. You actually have to go back several thousand years prior to Christianity to see where Christianity even came from. That's something I feel when people create a dichotomy between paganism and Christianity, I think it's a pretty superficial analysis because the story is actually a lot older. I think it goes back to the invention of urbanism. I think urbanism itself was a religious phenomenon. It wasn't just some kind of secular technological phenomenon. It was religious. So if we really want to talk about the distinction between paganism and Christianity, I think that's a superficial question. The deeper one is really we're talking about pre-urban humanity, which is very intuitive, in which you don't really need to deviate from your intuitions very much. You don't need these abstracted religious systems that make you feeling shameful and guilty. It's the introduction of urbanism that radically changes our environment and requires a kind of abstraction and linguistics and eventually written language that creates guilt and shame ultimately. And that's what Christianity tries to address. Christianity is not the problem. It's not the origin point. It's actually attempting to heal the wounds caused by urbanism. It's actually trying to address that, which is why Christianity really explodes when the Roman Empire has these explosion of urbanism, right? All of these roads are being built, and you've got Latin as a lingua franca, and there's just so many people. It changes the psychological environment. And so there's a crisis going on, and Christianity comes and actually tries to attempt to address that in a meaningful way. And when people criticize Christianity, we'll just get rid of that, and we'll just go back to paganism, you're just a moth advocating to fly into the bug zapper. That's how I see it. It doesn't mean that every single ideological abstracted system is correct, and there's a lot of straw manning that goes on where, there's even something correct in the assessment that Christianity makes people weak. The Roman Empire had already been attempting the pacification of the population, and to say that we should, as Romans, we should follow the law. A lot of the laws were not intuitive, okay? So already before Christianity, in quote-unquote pagan Rome, you already had a high level of abstraction going on, which compared to now seems quite low. But compared to what came before, the Romans were pacifying their population. The death penalty was frequent. And they actually genetically changed the population to be a population that was in many ways barbarous and pagan. And they made that population a rule-abiding population, and a population that was ripe for Christianity. Now, the pagan is going to decry this and say this is terrible, that you're enslaving the masses, and that civilization is evil, that what's good is pagan culture and what's evil is Christian civilization. We need to go back. My argument would be something like we can't go back. My argument would be that you may assert these things, you may wish these things were true, you may wish to go back to a time of intuition. We can't just go back. We have to go forward. Those pagan intuitions lost. They failed. They were conquered. They were dominated. You hear pagans complaining about, oh, Charlemagne, he killed the Saxons and he cut down our trees. It's like, yeah, because he was more powerful. The very ironical thing is these people complain about how Christianity is weak and how we need a religion of power. It's like, you guys were slaughtered. You guys were beaten. You guys were destroyed, because you were weak compared to the new systems that came along, because those systems were in some sense better. They might not have been better from your pagan perspective, but just in terms of a kind of it's funny, these social Darwinists and whatever, might makes right people, they hate Christianity, they love paganism, but in terms of just might makes right, in terms of which is the stronger system, a civilization with millions of people, with urbanism, with cities, with slaves. Pagans want to call Christianity a slave system, slave morality. Well, I'm sorry, slave morality beats your quote-unquote master morality every time, just historically speaking. It always wins. Slave morality wins because it's able to marshal more people, because it's able to organize them, because it's able to think abstractly and apply those abstractions and create moral codes from them to adapt more quickly. Your moral intuitions are weak, dude. You're just flying into a bunch of bug zappers. You're out there, you're bodybuilding, you're getting tan, and meanwhile, you're nothing. You're nothing, right? That's not to say that a Christian is powerful, right? The average Christian is as much a wage slave as your, tanned bodybuilder. But ultimately, a system which is pagan in nature, which is purely ascribing to intuitions, it's not going to beat a Christian or post-Christian system. We can criticize liberalism. We can see how it's kind of gone off the rails. We can understand how it's a sexual fetishization of a sadomasochistic domination submission complex of getting on your knees for white privilege is a sexual act. These people are getting off on this. Like, they are having an abstract, not a bodily orgasm, I hope not. I hope that would be gross. But they are having like a mental orgasm at the thought of humiliating themselves. And on the other side, you've got right-wingers who are getting off on the idea of Trump deploying the military. And, there are all these sexual energies surrounding this that we see, that Keynes was right, that the economy and governance in general is ruled by these animal spirits, deriving ultimately from Freud. That these are all crazy animal spirits, and nothing makes sense. And it's very, I'm not saying we can't criticize this, or that we have to totally buy into it, or that everything's just great the way it is, and nothing's going to change. It's the end of history, said Francis Fukuyama. It's always going to be this way. We're just going to ride out into the sunset. No, there's big changes that are coming. There's big changes. We are going to go further and further into Caesarism, into a military dictatorship on the streets. The right wing will love it because they support anything the military does. The left wing will love it as long as the white people get on their knees 5 times a day at the ascribed prayer time. We're seeing these riot police getting on their knees, and the people are clapping and cheering and hugging them and shaking their hands. This is all the left wants. The left, it's often said on the right that fascism will come to America carrying the cross and wrapped in the American flag. Well, we're also starting to understand that, Caesarism is going to come wrapped in liberalism and kneeling for Black Lives Matter and all those things. So we're really converging beyond left and right. We're really converging on a kind of third position that it's not serving the people. It's a third position of we're going to have hyper-capitalism. We're going to have environmental abuse. We're going to have hormonal abuse. We're going to have fast food. We're going to have total destruction of the population. But we're also going to have extreme leftism. I mean, it is a kind of third position. So that is what's going to happen. We're not going to keep the system as we had. Like, liberalism as it is today is untenable. It's going to change. And so we can be critical of that. But while we're critical of that, there's this very simplistic pagan perspective that says, therefore, Christianity is the root of all evil, and we got to destroy it and burn a bunch of churches down. And that is just so simplistic, and it doesn't even attempt to understand why Christianity developed, other than, well, I guess there's like Spenglerian cycles, and we just became weak, and like, or it's just Christianity was just a conspiracy theory of elites to destroy us. When clearly there was an attempt by the Roman Empire to pacify the population. And in doing so, they basically inculcated virtues in the population of it's good to be passive. You know, Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics said it's good to not buy into your anger. It's good to control your emotions. The, Ragnar Redbeard Nietzscheans would say, no, if you feel a passion, you must take it to the ends of the earth. And frankly, those people get zapped. They get zapped because your passions, while they may have been adapted to your environment in the past, they're certainly not adapted to today's environment. Whenever you get angry at somebody, if you just punch them in the face, not going to end up good for you. If every time you feel lust, you just pursue it to the ends of the earth, not going to work out great for you. And yet we have all these things naturally, intuitively. We have to deal with them in some way. We can't pretend they just don't exist. But we can't just buy into them uncritically. We also just can't accept any system that wafts along and smells good. Oh, I like equality. Yeah, sure, I'll get on my knees. That's also problematic, right? So the idea that like any ideological system is correct simply because it's ideological, simply because it denies intuition. Being a strict anti-intuitionist doesn't make any sense. Being a strict intuitionist doesn't make any sense. And I think that's, if we're going to talk about a deeper dichotomy than just paganism versus Christianity, I think that's the dichotomy. And I think it's difficult. I don't think there are always clear answers. I don't think it's simple because the world is a complicated place. There's not always going to be an easy answer. I can't just point to you to an authority that doesn't want to destroy you. It is very self-satisfying to believe in total equality and to be a masochist. It's fun to like, oh, you slap me around. Oh, well, I enjoy that. I get off on that. Oh, being a cuck. Oh, yeah, I actually like that. You think you're bullying me? I'm actually getting off right now. Like, those people are experiencing this endorphin dopamine rush out of doing that, whether it's, the actual sexual practice or whether it's on this ideological level. They feel good. They're like, you're gonna put me up on the cross. Well, I like it. I feel good about it. I can social signal about it on social media, but we obviously see the limitations of that. We obviously see that can only go so far before we run into problems. So if you're just saying, okay, which is better, intuition or anti-intuition, well, strictly speaking, you're going to run into problems if you just take any one of those positions to its logical conclusion. We have to say that just because there's an ideology doesn't mean it's right. Just because there's an intuition doesn't mean it's right. And the method of trying to decide which is right and wrong is going to be very complicated. And there's going to be an intuitive portion of that at some level that says things like, life is better than death, and we have to be able to access those. And they're very powerful. I mean, our passions are what get us out of bed in the morning. If you live a passionless life, that's called depression. You're never going to accomplish anything. You have to be able to engage. I'm not saying the passions are evil. I'm saying that we have to be able to mediate those passions and direct them in the right way. We don't have to extinguish our passions. We don't have to hate our passions as a category. But we have to be able to select from those passions which we're going to amplify and which we're going to suppress. And that requires an ideological, essentially an abstraction, to be able to decide, or at least submitting yourself to religious authorities. The problem we've run into is that the religious authorities want to kill us, and so they've created a bunch of, they say, consume fast food, buy fancy clothes, do all these things. they're really hurting us. And so there are some people who, in response, they get so puffed up in this realization of, oh my gosh, all this ideology was literally invented to kill us, and then they say Christianity was a mistake, and we got to go back to the Bronze Age, bodybuilding, tanning, and that's the only solution. Well, that's kind of a silly, I understand why people do that. I understand why people want to go live in the woods. I felt like that at many times. Probably will continue to on occasion look at something like, man, I think I just need to go live in the woods, You get those feelings, and I understand where those come from, but ultimately it's not correct. Ultimately, it's not correct to say we can just go back. It's just wrong. It's wrong. And there's really, rather than that simplistic solution of, oh, I hate Christianity and it's just evil, it's like, no, understand there's power in Christianity. If you really believe might makes right, there's power in quote-unquote slave morality. And you have to understand the way things work. You have to understand the way civilization works. It's not just a, accidental phenomenon, or if we're just going to speak in the language of power, and I've said this before, people who say things like, the truth doesn't matter, only power matters. It's like, well, that is, first of all, a truth statement. You're making trying to state something about the world. You're trying to assert a fact. So already we've got a paradox there. And then, on the other hand, the truth is very powerful. And so that's also self-defeating, right? The truth is powerful. The truth, if you have the truth, if you know something your opponent doesn't, then you can often get the upper hand with less resources, right? If you know when the attack is going to happen, if you have foresight and you have foreknowledge that's abstracted, like we see this all the time, humans versus animals. Obviously, a bear is bigger than a human, but if a human can use abstraction to create a firearm or to purchase one as a result of a civilized process of abstraction and mechanization and technics, as Heidegger called it, the human's going to win. This is a part where I feel Heidegger is an honest pagan when he says things like, the problem we have is that technics is so powerful and it's taking over the world. It is a problem. It does cause us psychological suffering, techniques, because we continually change our environment. We don't have time to adapt to it. There's an issue with it, right? There's an issue with it. And I don't deny that it's causing a lot of harm and suffering. And I don't intuitively desire everyone to be harmed and suffered, especially because I'm not in a position of authority. And I feel the harm and suffering myself. So, of course, I want to alleviate it for myself. And if I could alleviate it for others, that would be awesome as well. But we're not going to change the world fundamentally by denying the power of Christianity and its consequences and just saying, oh, well, it's about pacifying the population and making us weak and it's slave morality, we have to reject it. No, it's like there's power in that. There's power in the abstraction that it brings, and it can clearly be misused, and we see how it's been misused, and the question is up in the air if people will be able to resist those misuses and get us back on a better path, or if we're just going to ride this out till basically 90% of the population goes extinct and we're living in a completely new world, right? We have yet to see if the current path we're on can be shifted. If we're just, the logical conclusion of where we're headed is basically 90% plus of the population just stops reproducing, and we're living in a different world. We can already see some of the things happening on the fringes, and if you just imagine that some of those things in the fringes get normalized, we're going to be living in a radically different world. And we can imagine what that looks like, and for a lot of people that's not very good. For a lot of people that means extinction. That means suffering. Who knows if such a course can be, if such a course is sustainable, right? A lot of the course that we're on now, I think, is only sustainable if we can come up with the technological adaptations to overcome the problems that we've created. Environmentalists say this all the time with, we've created this awesome technology, but the side effect is we're destroying the planet. Is there a way we can come up with new technology to kind of paper over and fix the it's like you're creating technology creates problems, then you create new technology to fix the problems that were created by the old technology. It's this endless cycle. That's the presumption. But what if the presumption is wrong? Then we've got some severe problems. Then that's when you start looking at civilizational collapse. So that question's open-ended, but it's an empirical question. It's not an intuitive question. It's not just like, oh, I feel the system should collapse, therefore it will. That's not good enough. That's not, you're going to get zapped. If you want to go out and live your life that way, you're going to get zapped. You have to be, I mean, there's no other choice than to go through again, it's seemingly impossible. And everyone watching, including myself, might die failing to succeed in this process. In some ways, it's an endless process throughout chronology, throughout space and time, that we should struggle to get on the right path. We should struggle to solve the problems in front of us. There is a kind of Buddhistic, satisfaction with your life, and just say, things happen and I'm okay with it. We can always step back and say the problems aren't as bad as we make them out to be, or we can disassociate from them or whatever, and we can stop working on them. But I think we should work on them. I think we should I think that's what life is about. I think it's trying to seek out problems and trying to address them, and not really keeping yourself awake at night worrying like, well, is it worth it? Are we just going to all die anyway? I think that is the anti-life philosophy. If you get to that point where your skepticism and your abstraction goes so far as to inhibit you from any sort of passion, inhibit you from any sort of action, you definitely can go on the extreme with these things, and that leads you to a very bad place. But there has to be some kind of... There is a best way to go about things, and I don't know what that is, but I know it's not simple. I know it's not going to be some satisfying, simple answer of like, we just have to burn down all the churches, or, we just have to humiliate ourselves, and after we humiliate ourselves, this is what both men and women, submissive men and women who seek after basically abusive partners, they do that because they are caught up in this masochistic drive of like, I actually like when my partner abuses me. I actually like being humiliated. I actually like being hurt and hit and all these things. And it feels good in the moment, but you take that far enough and you're going to end up in the hospital. You're going to end up in a very bad place. And as a society, we're seeing these two urges conflict with one another. We're seeing people who are just following their intuitions, who are getting hurt and who are suffering. And we see people who are just attaching to these viriological ideologies, and they're getting burned as well. And everybody's, even if you try to avoid these destructive paths, everyone's affected. You can't escape it. So it's not an easy world, is it? It's not a simplistic world. We don't live as animals. We don't live in a world of easy answers and just pure action, and we don't have to think about things. We don't have to deal with things. It's not an easy world, but it's the world that we live with, and we have to confront it. We can't just ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist and live in the fantasy of easy answers. That's my take, 50-minute take. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.